All right, so I think we can get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here for the first MD4SG Colloquium for this semester. Please remember to mute yourself when you enter, but do feel free to ask questions throughout the talk, and we'll have a discussion at the very end as well for clarifying questions or any comments you might have. So again, welcome everyone. Welcome Jim Leape, who is a senior fellow at Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and a co-director for the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions. Jim looks at how to drive large-scale systemic shifts to sustainability through direct engagement with private and public sector leaders, as well as research and writing. Jim also has more than 3 decades of conservation experience, and from 2005 and 2014, he served as Director General of the World Wildlife Fund International and leader of the Global World Wildlife Fund Network, which is one of the world's largest conservation organizations. Jim serves on several more boards and works with way more organizations than I have the time to say here. We're very excited to welcome him and for him to talk about harnessing global markets for a transition to sustainability. So thank you so much and welcome, Jim. We can get started whenever you're ready. Oh,
Great.
And sorry, I forgot to say, for whoever is on our YouTube live stream, please chat your questions and we will ask them in the session here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to meet with all of you. My topic today is sustainability, and I could, of course, spend the whole hour on defining the sustainability challenge, but I want to move quickly into some of the exciting opportunities we've seen in recent years for harnessing global markets in that cause. So let me just start with a brief introduction to the challenge of sustainability. I mean, in simple terms, this challenge is, how do we build a future in which 10 billion people can live in prosperity in ways that the planet can support, right? And how do we live with a growing population with growing demands for the humanity, but in a way that this planet can support? And that's the basic challenge of sustainability. There are 2 facts that bring home to me and I hope will bring home to you the magnitude of that challenge. One is that we are moving into uncharted territory. You have seen many, many statistics, studies of the impacts of climate change. For me, this is the single most startling one, and it is the recognition that over the last 10,000 years, we have enjoyed a remarkably stable climate. Temperature has varied only within a range of a single degree centigrade. And yet we are already now moving out of that range and moving very quickly out of that range, with some projections suggesting a temperature increase of 3 or 4 degrees by the end of this century. And if you think of 10,000 years as not very long, it isn't very long in geologic time, but think of what happened in that 10,000 years. Basically, the development of all of human civilization, right? It was the advent of agriculture and the advent of every great civilization you can think of, from the Chinese to the Egyptians to the Greeks to the Renaissance to modern times. And then the second is this study that came out a year and a half ago, which calculated what percentage of mammals on land are wild animals. That's a question I would usually ask my class, but not in this format. But the answer is, for me, startling. The answer is 4%. And that's an indication of just how pervasively we now dominate the human landscape, the global landscape. Because 96% of all the mammals on land by weight are humans, 36%, and the animals we grow to eat, or in the small case of horses, to ride. And so it is just a reminder that we have come to the point that as 7.5 billion people with growing demands on the earth, we are affecting every corner of the earth and in a very dominating way. So those two facts for me set the frame for thinking about sustainability as we recognize that we're in an era in which our impacts are so pervasive. What does that mean for how we rise to the challenge of charting a course that the earth can actually sustain? And what I want to do is take 2 examples of areas in which markets have begun to move towards supporting sustainability, just to illustrate the possibilities. And the first of those examples is deforestation. Forests are the most important ecosystem on land. On land, they host most of the Earth's biodiversity, especially the tropical rainforests that ring the globe. And yet those forests have been disappearing at an alarming rate over the last several decades. The causes, the significance is clear. I mean, those are not only important for biodiversity and for local watersheds and so forth, they're also, the clearing of forests is also a major source of climate change. 24%, nearly a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions come from deforestation and the agriculture that is associated with deforestation. 71% of that forestation comes from the clearing of land to produce more crops or to raise more livestock. So one example of this pressure on forests is palm oil. Palm oil is produced mostly in Southeast Asia. It has become the most important vegetable oil. It is in fact a very efficient way to produce vegetable oil, much more efficient, for example, than growing soy or growing safflower or other oil crops. But the expansion of the production of palm oil has come at a huge cost. This is a recent phenomenon starting in the mid-60s. Palm oil production rose from practically zero in Malaysia and Indonesia, rose very quickly in Malaysia, and then about a decade later followed in Indonesia, so that these two countries together now produce about 85% of the world's palm oil. It is in almost every product you can think of. Half of the products in the grocery store contain palm oil. It's in things like cup noodles. It's in organic crunchy peanut butter in Whole Foods. It's in lipstick, it's in shampoo, it's in ice cream, it's in all sorts of products. It is mostly invisible. To find palm oil in the grocery store, you have to read the fine print on the back of the label on the back of a product, and it's often masquerading as vegetable oil. So it's actually been a hard issue to come to grips with. And our progress over the last couple of decades in addressing the deforestation pressure caused by palm oil production has come from a couple of breakthroughs. One is to recognize the role of big players with big brands. And this comes first from a recognition and research done by WWF about 15 or 20 years ago, which recognized that if you look at the 15 commodities that represent most of the pressure on biodiversity around the world, so that's palm oil and soy and beef and timber, also tuna and shrimp, cotton, etc. If you look across those 15 products, there are about 1.5 billion producers, farmers and fishermen who are producing those products. And there are about 7.5 billion consumers, right? So those are big numbers, very hard to see how you change the behavior of farmers or fishermen by engaging with them directly when there are so many. And similarly hard to engage consumers on that kind of scale. But the recognition was that actually in the supply chain that connects producers to consumers, there are pinch points. And in fact, there are about 500 multinational companies that control 70% of the trade in those 15 commodities. And that leads to the recognition that if you can engage those 500 big actors, you can drive change across these huge global systems. And that's the genesis of the market initiatives that I will talk about here, both on deforestation and then later on fishing. The second recognition that came along with this discovery of pinch points is the recognition that many of those multinational companies have consumer-facing brands. And it turns out that companies with consumer-facing brands are exquisitely sensitive to risks to those brands. And that means that there is the possibility to create incentives, interests in helping to drive change in support of sustainability. You can see how this played out in the case of palm oil. Unilever is the largest buyer of palm oil in the world. Unilever makes all the Dove beauty products, so it uses palm oil in soap and shampoos. It also is a large producer of margarine and many other consumer products that use palm oil. So it by itself accounted a decade ago when this story starts for about 4% of global palm oil purchases around the world. Unilever had been leading something it called the Campaign for Real Beauty to promote its Dove products. And so with ads like this, was trying to communicate the message that those are products for everybody, that there are many kinds of beauty. Greenpeace took that ad and translated it into this format. So playing off of Unilever's branding, brought home the message that Unilever, in producing Dove beauty products, was also driving the destruction of rainforests and killing orangutans in Indonesia. Similar effort was then taken up against Nestle. Nestle makes many consumer products. One of them is Kit Kat. Kit Kat bar is made in part with palm oil. I'm not going to show the video here, but if you go into YouTube and search for Greenpeace Kit Kat, you will see the video that Greenpeace launched online in a very graphic, I would say, vivid way to bring home that actually orangutans were dying because rainforest was being destroyed to grow palm oil that was sold to Nestle for Kit Kat bars. And these two initiatives, going against Unilever, going at Nestle at their valued brands, brought quick results. In the case of Unilever, 4 days after those Greenpeace ads ran, Unilever committed to sourcing only sustainably produced palm oil. Nestle fought the Greenpeace campaign for 3 weeks. These were the early days of social media, and they didn't know better. They lost that fight, in particular when Greenpeace activists dressed as orangutans dropped from the ceiling into the middle of the Nestle annual general meeting. And so bringing home this connection to their investors as well as to their consumers. And so Nestle then also committed to sourcing only sustainable palm oil. So these two stories are important because they illustrate that actually it is possible to take a sustainability challenge and translate it into a risk to a brand. And facing risks to their brands, companies can move very boldly to try and take action to address that risk. As the companies moved into this cause, they realized that actually this was a hard problem to solve by themselves. And in fact, I met with the chief executive of Unilever shortly after they'd made this commitment, a guy named Paul Polman, who became a leader in this cause. And Paul said to me, we need your help to figure out how to meet our commitment to find 4% of the global market that is sustainably produced that we can buy as our source of palm oil. But 5 months later, when we met again, he said, look, I've looked into this. I've realized we can meet our own commitment, but it will be better for us and better for the world if we find a way to work together to move the whole market to sustainable production. And it was that insight from him and from other company CEOs that led to the recognition that actually the path here lies in finding new ways to collaborate. And the first example of that was pre-competitive collaborations. Right? It was a recognition that Unilever could move on its own, Nestle could move on its own, but they weren't going to get a competitive advantage from moving on their own. And they ran much more risk because they ran the risk that they would be undercut. They would have to pay a higher price for sustainable palm oil, and they would be undercut in the marketplace. So it was in their interest as well as in the interest of the world if the whole sector moved towards driving sustainability into this commodity. And that led to a commitment by the Consumer Goods Forum. Consumer Goods Forum is 400 companies that represent about $2 trillion in trade. And Unilever, Nestle, and others worked together to get a commitment by the Consumer Goods Forum that they would source only commodities produced without causing deforestation. So suddenly you had all of these consumer-facing companies working in concert to try to drive sustainability into this sector. As those consumer-facing companies drove progress, then you saw actually increasing pressure on the trading companies that supply them. The largest trading company in palm oil is Wilmar. It accounted for, at this point, about 40% of the trade in palm oil. And traders often operate in the shadows. I don't mean that pejoratively, but they don't have consumer-facing brands, so they are largely invisible. But as their customers increasingly were demanding sustainability, the pressure grew on those traders to also find a way to step up. And so you saw in the couple of years that followed, so this is 2011, 2012, a growing number of traders recognizing they had to be part of this movement. And so you get to the point that by 2012 or 13, you have about 70 or 80% of the palm oil market, buyers and traders and even producers, committed to sustainable palm oil, to producing palm oil without deforestation in particular. which is a remarkable accomplishment. And I think, you know, you get to 2012 or 13, I think most people in this business who were focused on this issue couldn't believe that we'd gotten so far, that you had the dominant players in the industry committing to sustainability. And that took one step further in 2012 with the creation of the Tropical Forest Alliance, which brought together these committed companies, along with some of the forest producing countries, along with the major NGOs, environmental groups working on these issues. And when that Tropical Alliance 2020 commitments was signed, you see here in 2013, Paul Pullman in the center, the chief executive of Unilever, President Yudhoyono of Indonesia on the right, committing themselves to working together to actually change the future, the trajectory of this sector, to actually address deforestation across palm oil production in Malaysia and in Indonesia. And I think the philosophy that underpins this is represented in this quote. It's a recognition here by one of the leading companies in the world that ultimately what has to happen is systems change. And to accomplish that, you have to be able to work in coalition. And the business has to be part of that because this is the system that gives them life in the first place. So actually quite a powerful philosophy, a recognition that this is about business, but that business can't do this alone, and that business has to find ways to work with each other, to work with their suppliers, to work with governments, and to work with NGOs to drive change. Now that's where we get to in 2013. 2014, there's a growing recognition that we have stunning commitment, but it's actually turning out to be very difficult to drive change in this sector. Right? This is a complicated sector. It's wrapped up in all of the complexity of land use and governance in a country, in a sprawling country like Indonesia, right? And actually very difficult, even with concerted action or commitment by companies to drive change into the system. So actually quite an important piece of this story is the forest fires that swept across Indonesia in 2015. These forest fires, there were more than 100,000 forest fires across Sumatra and Borneo. These are forest fires, almost every one of which was intentionally set. These are fires generally set to clear land, often for palm oil production, and fires that in a particularly dry El Nino year just kept burning. Ordinarily in moist tropical forest, a fire can be set, it will burn some land and it will burn out. But these fires just kept burning. And these are peat soils, so they're 5 or 10 meters of peat underneath the surface. And the fire just goes down in that peat and keeps burning and burning and burning. And so you had fires that swept across these regions. This graph shows you the carbon emissions from those fires in September and October, August, September, October of 2015. All those yellow bars in September and October are the days on which the emissions from the fires in Indonesia exceeded the total emissions of the United States, right? So these fires were a climate catastrophe, and they were also a public health catastrophe. The World Bank estimated that Harvard estimated that 1 million people would have shortened lives because of the emissions from these fires. I was in Singapore at the time of the fires. The concentrations in Singapore were okay. The unhealthy level is 100. The average level in most schools in Malaysia was 300, and in parts of Borneo, Indonesian Borneo, it was as high as 1,500. So 15 times the healthy level. So it was a public health catastrophe. It was an economic catastrophe, a 2% hit on GDP, and also a climate disaster. And so those fires actually were a tipping point in awareness in Indonesia of the seriousness of the deforestation problem and the link to palm oil production. President Joko Widodo, the then by now president of Indonesia, visited the fires, recognized the crisis, and put drastic measures in place. And so what you see here, and I don't know if you can see it with pictures along the side of your screen, but what you can see here is that actually in the last couple of years, you've seen a precipitous drop in the destruction of primary forests in Indonesia. That's about a 40% drop in 2018 from the average of the several years before 2012 to 2016. So we have hope in Indonesia, but it comes from two things. It comes from a concerted push by industry to really press to find ways to grow palm oil without destroying forests. And then the awakening of government to the seriousness of this crisis and concerted government action to complement that corporate pressure. It has run up against what is a stubborn challenge. And that is the challenge that about 40% of palm oil production is in the hands of 2.5 million small producers who are typically growing palm oil on palm trees on 1 or 2 hectares of land. And it just turns out that if you're trying to drive change in a global system, you may have a handful of companies that have a lot of leverage, but it gets very complicated when you're trying to change practices of 2.5 million producers scattered across the landscape. And so over the last several years, the sort of defining challenge in this sector has been how do you actually see through these commitments and translate them into change, including embracing change with the small producers. Because this is not a victory. Success cannot be that large plantations have found a way to get certified as sustainable and small producers are excluded from those markets. One of the most promising efforts to address this problem is an effort that Joanne de Zegher and Irene Lowe, both in this group, have been a part of over the last couple of years, an effort called PEM. And I will not do it justice. There should be a completely separate session devoted to this. But for me, it's an exciting example of the potential for innovation to crack this stubborn problem at the heart of the palm oil challenge. This recognizes that there's a supply chain from the producer through middlemen to the mills that process palm fruit into palm oil. And PEM creates an information platform that offers real benefit to mills who are able to better advertise their prices to attract new sellers, to middlemen who can reduce costs by creating a more efficient logistics system in the center of the supply chain, and to farmers who get access to more options for selling their fruit and better pickup. All of those, the information platform offers these benefits, but at the same time, by creating a digital platform for this system, creates traceability, which is one of the most stubborn problems in driving sustainability into an ecosystem of small producers. So this is the kind of innovation that I think will be absolutely central to the sustainability of palm oil going forward. And I think for me, an exciting example of the potential for the kinds of work that you all do being part of driving change in these markets. So that's the palm oil story. I'm very focused on land, very focused on working with communities, with small producers, with large companies to tackle the challenge of global deforestation. What I'd like to do is switch to a different ecosystem to just illustrate how these kinds of approaches play out in a very different context. And then I'm happy to open it up, but also happy to take questions along the way if anyone wants to shout out. Okay, let's go into overfishing. I don't think, I direct the Center for Ocean Solutions here. I don't think I've given a talk anywhere in the last 3 years in which the first question hasn't been about plastics. Plastics, the challenge of plastics in the ocean has captured the imagination of the public and captured the attention of companies and governments around the world. It's a big problem. I mean, we're putting 8 or 9 million tons of plastic into the ocean every year. One group estimated that was equivalent to 5 grocery bags full of plastic waste on every foot of coastline for the entire world. So it's a lot of plastic. It's a big problem. It's actually most important as the tip of the iceberg, as a reminder that we are actually having a pervasive influence on the ocean ecosystem, even though we've always thought it was limitless. Because we are in fact not only filling the ocean with waste, we are changing the chemistry and the physics of the ocean. Greenhouse gas emissions, especially CO2, are making the ocean more acidic, and at the same time they are warming it. And you see this in the bleaching of coral reefs around the world, but you see it also in the die-off of kelp forests here in California. So we are fundamentally changing the nature of ocean ecosystems. And aside from climate change, our most persistent assault on ocean ecosystems is to harvest huge quantities of biomass, huge quantities principally of fish, out of ocean waters. And that's having a profound effect on ocean ecosystems, but also a profound effect on the ocean's ability to support us into the future. So this is a big challenge. I mean, you can think about it as the challenge of the seafood industry that supplies all of us, whether that's in seafood restaurants, in fast food restaurants, or in school lunches. But it is also profoundly important to the well-being of coastal communities around the world. There are 1 billion people for whom seafood, fish, is the principal source of protein. And that's caught in often in small scale fisheries and sold in informal markets. But it is both a global challenge for the food supply and fundamentally important to the well-being of many of the least developed countries around the world. Now, this has not always been a challenge. I mean, 300 or 400 years ago, the seas were truly abundant, truly full of fish. When European fishers came to Newfoundland to fish the Grand Banks off of the coast of Canada in the 17th and 18th centuries, their reports were there were so many fish, it was hard to row a boat through them. Maybe apocryphal, but clearly there were a lot of fish, right? And then you see for decades, that Grand Banks cod fishery was fished at 1 or 2, sometimes 300,000 tons of fish a year. And then suddenly in the 50s, the fishing effort takes off. It peaks 15 or 20 years later at about 800,000 tons and collapses. And in 1992, there are no more fish. And one of the richest fisheries in the world has been completely wiped out. And this story, the story of the cod fishery in the Grand Banks, is just an example of the broader assault on fisheries around the world. What happened in 1950 was that fishing went global, and fishing trawlers, fishing boats left their home ports and spread out across the planet. They spread out with much more powerful technology than they had before. So suddenly dragging nets that could catch a dozen 747s, dragging lines literally miles long filled with hooks to catch fish, able to catch much more on a single trip than had been possible before, able to stay at sea for months at a time, offloading their catch into freezer vessels that stop by. So suddenly a wholly different industry. And the result is that between 1950 and the turn of the century, the catch increased a dozenfold, right? From 8 million tons to 95 million tons. And you can see this in this map. So this is a fishing effort in 1950. The warm colors are areas of significant fishing. So you can see that significant fishing is very much concentrated in coastal areas, mostly North America, Western Europe, and the east coast of Asia. So that's the picture in 1950. It's a coastal enterprise. As a fisher colleague said to me, fishermen in those days liked to be able to hear their dog bark. That's slightly exaggerated, but they stayed, generally speaking, close to shore. And a half a century later, you can see that fishing really has gone global. You have fishing efforts anywhere in the ocean that there are fish to catch. And that's become the nature of the challenge. Not just how do you locally manage a fishing community that's catching fish in local waters, but actually how do you manage a global enterprise? And so this requires actually a couple of innovations that are unique, have been unique to this sector, or at least particularly important in this sector. One is salience, and the second is solutions. And let me say what I mean. So the challenge of salience is that 20 years ago, nobody thought twice about what fish they bought, right? If you went to the store, you looked for what kind of fish, the kind of fish you liked, whether it was salmon or swordfish or tuna or haddock. You looked at price, you looked at quality. Did it look fresh or was it frozen? And so actually a super important first step in the effort to drive sustainability into this sector was to actually bring to the fore a recognition that we needed to pay more attention to what fish we ate, pay more attention to what fish we bought. It was to help people realize that some fisheries were in trouble. And that actually we needed to do something about it. So this was an area in which NGOs didn't go after particular companies. They went after particular fisheries to just help crystallize this message. And so Take a Pass on Chilean Sea Bass was a campaign by the National Environmental Trust. Give Swordfish a Break, a campaign by CWEB and NRDC. which just were shining a spotlight on two fisheries that were in real trouble, where fisheries were on the verge of collapse or had collapsed, to help people recognize that they needed to pay more attention. And these public campaigns relied on media, but they also enlisted celebrity chefs who had become an important vehicle for communications. They found ways to run articles not only in the front pages and the environmental pages, but in the food pages, to just reach people in multiple channels to help them see that actually there was something going on here and that we needed to think more about the fishery buy. Many of you have probably seen the Seafood Watch consumer guides or similar consumer guides. WWF has put out guides like this in 17 different countries. Guides that tell you which fish is sustainable and what fish is not. This guide is now available in a phone app, of course. And when you are looking at a restaurant menu or looking at the fresh fish counter, this guide allows you to see whether the fish that's on offer is one that's comes from a well-managed fishery. These guides also came out about 20 years ago, were quite important both for raising salience, right, for helping people recognize they should pay attention, and for offering a solution. At least you could consult your guide and know which fish you should be choosing. And a second important solution here is certification. Certification is an approach developed in the context of forests, but then translated quickly into this context. It came out of a partnership between WWF and Unilever. Unilever, not only the largest buyer of palm oil, but also at this time, 1998, the largest seller of frozen fish in the world. They own Gorton's of Gloucester, Igloo, and others. Unilever recognized that fish were running out, that there was a danger that their supply would disappear. And so they joined with WWF to create something called the Marine Stewardship Council. And the goal here was to define standards for the sound management of fisheries and provide therefore a basis for the independent certification of fisheries against those standards, right? It created a global system against which any fishery could be assessed by an independent auditor. And if it passed that assessment, it earned the right to sell its product as certified sustainable. And in fact, could also be eligible to sell its product with the MSC logo on that product. This was an important step beyond seafood guides, because seafood guides require the consumer to pull something out of his wallet and look up the fish that she or he were considering buying. With this, all they have to do is look at the label. This was not welcomed in the seafood industry. The leading industry publication at the time ran this cover story, seeing this push on sustainability as a threat to the industry. And indeed it was. I mean, it was an effort to actually change the way the industry did business. But MSC certification began to get hold, and you could begin to see it in the fresh fish counter, so the wet counter, and also on canned and frozen products. And the idea is this label allows buyers to know quickly which fish is okay to buy. But the important step in this story, or at least the next important step in this story, is getting to scale. And what happened here is actually fundamentally important for thinking about how you drive change in markets like this. In those first several years, from 1998 to 2005, you had the beginnings of traction for the sustainable seafood movement. You had first fisheries coming online to get certified. You had initial buyers beginning to prefer certified sustainable product. Those initial buyers were Sainsbury's in the UK, Whole Foods in the US, Migros and Co-op in Switzerland. Small, relatively small supermarket chains whose positioning in the market was centered around sustainability, organic, progressive products. But then in 2006, Walmart committed to sourcing MSC certified fish. And the commitment of Walmart is literally a game changer in this effort. You can see the impact in this graph. The green line is fisheries entering certification, that is entering the assessment process. The blue line is fisheries who have won certification. And you can see in 2006 that there are maybe 20 fisheries who have been certified and maybe 20 more who are in assessment. Walmart's commitment is announced at the beginning of 2006. And you can see the number of fisheries entering assessments. The green line just takes off. Right? And the blue line then with a year lag as those fisheries get through the assessment process also takes off. So that several years later, you've gone from 20 fisheries certified to 300 fisheries certified. This is not just Walmart. McDonald's also committed at the same time. Well, McDonald's now sources only certified fish in its North American stores and its European stores. That's a big deal, but McDonald's only buys whitefish, so only one part of the market. Walmart sources, of course, every kind of fish. So the Walmart commitment stands out as particularly important, and you can see how that commitment by a large buyer really ripples through the entire market. So MSC in 2019 looks like this. So about 15% of the global marine catch has been certified. One can decide whether that glass is 15% full or 85% empty. There's a lot of work to do here, right? I mean, this is absolutely work in progress. But you have 15% of the market now in the system. Most importantly to me, you have important subsectors where progress has been much more significant. So more than 40% of wild salmon now is sold as MSC certified, and more than 70% of whitefish, so those are the fish, cod and haddock and pollock and so forth, that are the stuff of fish sticks and McDonald's sandwiches and fish and chips and similar products. More than 70% of that market is now operating under MSC certification. So you can see here the potential in those two subsectors. You can see the potential for these things to really scale and for something like MSC certification to really become a powerful force across a global marketplace. Here you see in this story an evolution that is similar to what you see in palm oil. And that is, as you begin to get market significance, you begin to get pre-competitive collaboration, competitors coming together to drive broader change. In this case, you see it in tuna canning. In the early 2000s, when the only committed buyers were Whole Foods and Sainsbury's and similar companies, we were not able to get the time of day with the tuna canning industry. Tuna canning, canned tuna in the US all had dolphin safe on its label. It was all certified as dolphin safe, and they felt pretty comfortable that that was all the certification they needed. They didn't need a broader sustainability commitment. And so we were pretty much stuck there in moving this agenda forward. And then Walmart made its commitment and said in 5 years it would only source MSC certified seafood. And that, of course, changes the game for someone like canned tuna, because if you are in the canned tuna business, you simply cannot afford to give up Walmart as a client. And the result was the creation of ISSF, which is about 20 companies that represent 75% of the world's canned tuna. So a huge share of the tuna market, who came together now a dozen years ago to actually work together to drive change in the way tuna are harvested, to drive sustainability into the tuna fishery, so that they would have a source of, they would be able to source certified sustainable tuna for their markets. So let me just summarize this story with these pieces. You know, this is an effort that starts with campaigning organizations, and I use Greenpeace here because they're the most well-known campaigning organization, but it was many environmental NGOs who were using campaigns to grow the salience of this issue, to help people realize that fisheries were in trouble and that we need to pay more attention. WWF was part of that, but WWF, more importantly, as an organization that could then, with the benefit of those campaigns, work with large players in this sector like Unilever and create solutions like certification that could help drive change across the system. That requires, of course, companies in the sector who are willing to be leaders, right? Who are willing to step up to the vanguard and actually be part of driving change. And buyers who are willing to support that, who are willing to be first movers and actually help give those efforts sort of market credibility. So when you get Whole Foods and you get Sainsbury's, you don't get scale, but you get that initial credibility that makes others pay attention and realize there's something here that maybe they should be part of. And then the big guys come in. And when you get commitment to a McDonald's and then a Walmart, suddenly you have a path to scale. And companies across the sector realize that this is something actually that maybe they can't afford to sit out. And that's what's then happened with canned tuna. There's a recognition that the markets, that many of their most important markets are increasingly demanding sustainability. They need to figure out how to drive change in their sector. Okay? So that's how this kind of effort can evolve, and it's how those incentives grow and change over the course of this effort. It does, I want to make one last point about this, which will resonate, of course, with what I said about palm oil. You quickly get into the challenge of then small producers, right? Certification is a good solution for large fisheries, which can afford to pay $100,000 for a certifier to come assess their fishery and qualify them to sell under a certification label. That's a much more difficult proposition for small scale fisheries. And so one of the abiding challenges here in seafood, as in deforestation, has been how do you create a system that really works for small producers? And that's going to take me into the last thing I want to talk about, which is tech. How is technology, how are technological innovations beginning to change the possibilities here? The technology has lots of implications for fisheries. It has some very large scale implications because the defining fact about fisheries is we know practically nothing about what's going on. Most fishing happens on the wide open ocean, far out of sight of land, and it's very hard to keep track. But in recent years, we've suddenly gained the capability to know what's happening out there. This is Global Fishing Watch, which uses satellite technology to pick up the pings from transponders that large boats are required to carry. They're required to carry transponders to keep them from running into each other in the dark or in the fog. But those transponder signals can be picked up by the satellite and used to track boats across the water. And it's large boats. So what you're seeing here is a map that captures about 60,000 boats, but it's an important start on getting a picture of the entire fishing fleet. It was created by Google in partnership with this guy, with Leonardo DiCaprio and Oceana, an ocean NGO. And this is just one example of the power it gives you. This is the track of a single trawler, a fishing boat out of the Marshall Islands. You can see it leave the Marshall Islands, cross the Pacific from left to right, cross the Pacific into the waters of Kiribati, a small island Pacific state. And you can see that blue line go down into that red square. That red square is a marine protected area, no fishing allowed. But you can see the blue line go into the red square, and right where in the left-hand corner of that square, there is the fishing track goes back and forth. I mean, the vessel track goes back and forth, and the computer knows that means it's fishing. So from this vessel track and from the behavior of the vessel on the water, satellite track tells you that it's fishing. So Kiribati is alerted to this by Global Fishing Watch. They call the Marshall Islands and say, your boat just fished in our marine protected area. That's not allowed. They collected a $2 million fine. So suddenly, for the first time, even small countries have the capability of knowing what's happening in their waters and of doing something about it. That capability is about to be enhanced by placement of video cameras on boats that allow the monitoring of the fish that are being caught to make sure they're catching the right things. They're catching tuna and not turtles, but also measuring the quantities of fish they're catching and correlating that to where they're fishing. So we're about to have much more information about what's happening on the water. And as we develop artificial intelligence tools to process those video and that video footage and to identify problem areas, we will be in a very strong position to actually identify fishers that are fishing illegally. So technology innovation has huge capacity for this whole equation, and the capacity to combine that transparency with traceability that allows you to trace the piece of tuna you have in the restaurant all the way back to the particular vessel, the particular trip, and the particular day on which that tuna was caught. That capability already going into place. But these tools, crucially, also offer new possibilities for bringing small-scale fishers into this system, right? Because these are tools that make it possible to provide much more information to small-scale fishers to manage their fishery. This is MFish. which is a smartphone-based app which allows fishers to stream information they need onto their smartphone, information about weather, about market price at different ports, about other things. It also provides a platform for them to collect the information on their own fishing that's important to managing the resource. And finally, the same enterprise is developing a second application called FishCoin, which allows a big company like Thai Union to compensate fishers, small-scale fishers or small-scale fish farmers, to provide the data that Thai Union needs for its own assurance of sustainability in the fish that it sources. So in this case, it is compensating small-scale shrimp farmers in Vietnam to provide data on their production practices so that it can affirm sustainability of those practices. And it compensates those fishermen with cell phone minutes, the universal currency valuable to people everywhere. So what you see over the last 15 or 20 years is the evolution of these kinds of efforts that have the potential to mobilize big forces in support of sustainability and support of more sustainable practices. Across the board, those efforts face challenges in driving that change into the system, right? In actually changing the practices of producers. That's going to require, as in the case of palm oil, government to join forces with these companies to drive those kinds of changes. It's also going to require technological innovations in designing mechanisms and designing tools that can actually support participation in those systems by small producers, whether those are small farmers in Indonesia or small fishers and fish farmers in Southeast Asia or elsewhere. But those forces in concert, so harnessing big market players, enlisting governments, harnessing the power of technology, have the potential to really make a difference in sustainability, and that's the most urgent cause we face in this century. So why don't I leave it there, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was a wonderful talk. If anyone has any questions now, feel free to ask.
Hi, I have a question. Namely, for the work that you mentioned on protecting fisheries. The success benchmarks that you've mentioned so far are what percentage of the market is certified. The question that I would have is, can you actually also measure the improvement that this has on fish stock? For example, you could imagine that maybe the sustainable fishing displaces some of the non-sustainable fishing and doesn't make things maybe as much better than one would hope.
Okay, so there are, I guess I'm not sure what you mean by sustainable displacing unsustainable.
It might be that because now all the sustainable fisheries are fishing in certain places, the fishermen who don't have to care about that fish in the places that are even worse.
Yeah. Okay. So let me say there's several things to say about that. It's a really good question. So you're focused on market share because market share is of course an important indicator of the success of this approach getting traction in the marketplace and its influence across that marketplace. The fisheries that are certified sustainable have been through a pretty robust process of determination that they are well managed and that the fishery there is sustainable, so that we have high confidence of the quality of those fisheries, right? There are, I think, there's several important questions though beyond that that you're touching on. One is, does the implementation of a certification regime and the incentive to get certified drive improvements of fisheries, right? Or to what extent are you certifying fisheries that are already well managed and now have a label to prove it? And to what extent are you actually incentivizing improved management? And that's a hard thing to generalize about. So every year or two, the Marine Stewardship Council does a sort of comprehensive review to identify, to pull together the evidence for what impacts the certification process and the incentives it have in terms of improving the management of fisheries, both in terms of the conditions imposed for fisheries that get certified and in terms of incentivizing fisheries to improve practice to be able to get into the system in the first place. So that's one part of the equation. I think you're highlighting a second part, which is a challenge both for fisheries, but also for palm oil, which is how do you make sure that, that you don't create a two-tier market, basically, in which you have certified sustainable fisheries that are supplying markets who care about that, and unsustainable fisheries or unsustainable palm oil production that continues to happily sell to markets that don't care. And that's definitely a hazard across all of these efforts. And I think so a big focus of MSC over the last 10 years has been to build market interest in China as the single most important seafood market in the world, and in other parts of Asia as overall by far the most important seafood markets in the world, to begin to create market interest and demand in those countries for sustainable product. You see actually quite rapid growth in Japan and now in China of interest in these things. It turns out that the proposition, especially in China, may be different. The proposition may tap into an interest in provenance, in having visibility about where fish came from, as in reflecting an interest in food safety. But that actually gets you a long way, right? Because traceability is absolutely foundational to driving sustainability, and I think one can hope is a stepping stone to a broader market concern about sustainability. But it's absolutely a central challenge to taking these efforts to scale.
Thank you.
Yep.
Related to that, I was going to ask also on what are the kind of incentives that work well for the small producers, and like what can countries do about that? Like in cases where, for example, like there's some negative incentives for like placing fees on certain organizations or on the states in which you can like track where has been like illegal fishing, and where can you do actually like provide subsidies or like incentivize a country to provide subsidies for them to do more sustainable fishing or sourcing of palm oil or other things. Like, do you ever see a tension between these two in the way different countries are dealing with them?
So that's also a really important question. So I mean, there are many ways to, many paths for creating incentives here for small producers. So one is, I think part of what, and I won't go too deep into this because Irene and Joanne could take you into it, but one is, I think, providing better access to market. I mean, is creating efficiencies in the market and information opportunities in the market that allow fishers to get a better price for their product, but while also creating traceability. A second is what you see in MSC is in some cases a chance to get access to markets that are more lucrative markets than these fishers would have access to otherwise. So you have small scale fisheries, for example, certified in the coast of Baja in Mexico, who have through certification been able to get access into the Western markets that offer a much higher price for their product than they could get otherwise. So I think there have been opportunities to do that. I think there is then also, as I think your question implies, there are strategies to reduce the cost of participation that lower the barriers to entry for those small scale fishers. And that can be finding ways to certify whole cooperatives or large scale sort of cooperatives of small scale producers, or in some cases, government subsidies. So you've had some governments, especially in Western Europe, but who have decided they would just subsidize their whole fishing industry to get MSC certified. And that, of course, is a way of helping small scale producers participate in that system. And was, I think, in those cases, a convenient way for government to raise the floor, as it were. I mean, to improve the management across all of its fishing industry, but in a way that also promised a market benefit in terms of their access to the markets that demands certified product.
Maybe two follow-up questions to that. So it seems like in the incentives that you described during your talk, you focused a lot on the initial role of sort of marketing, branding, and then getting buy-in from the company and supplier level. And so I was wondering, what are some of the main challenges as you've observed them for these companies, the large companies, once they've committed to sustainability goals, from the commitment to actually acting on those in a credible way? And then a related question, I think related to the one that Anna just asked, is what's the interaction between the welfare of small companies, smallholder participants who supply these companies and the company commitments? And so you mentioned some way that technology and also these two tools of large cooperatives and subsidies can help align the incentives of the small players with the larger companies, but there's still fundamentally an imbalance of power. Is it that the pie is getting smaller and more of the pie is going to the company than the smallholders? What are some of the challenges there?
Okay.
And
so that was a lot. So the first is the second is what are the challenges in terms of making this work for small producers? The first is what are the challenges within these companies, right? So I'd say these sectors are a little different, but I think what you saw in the sort of 2006 to 2014 period was a flourishing of commitment, right? And you had a lot of companies in different domains stepping up and making commitments. And that was honestly, truly important, right? That you had big players making public commitments to do things differently in a way that was important for sustainability. Also very heartwarming, right? I mean, everybody celebrated, everybody was excited that all this movement was there. And it just turned out that making commitments was, of course, by far the easy part, and that actually getting into the business of delivering these commitments in many cases proved to be much more difficult than companies thought it would be. That's not true in everything. I mean, I think in some domains, I think in renewable energy, for example, you see companies really driving significant progress in some cases towards living up to commitments they've made. But in a case like palm oil, just turns out to be really complicated to drive change in such a system. And so I think, from my external observing this from the outside, I see companies faced three challenges. One is just sustaining will at the top, right? I mean, that, you made this commitment, but there are a lot of things on the plate of a CEO, and just sustaining will at the top, the commitment at the top is I think challenging, especially as CEOs turn over every few years. The second is actually, it's harder than it sounds to drive commitment down through an organization that is, 100,000 or 200,000 employees, and which has a procurement operation that for all of recorded history has been focused on price and quality, and you're suddenly asking to pay attention to sustainability. And so it's, I think, been very difficult for some of these companies to drive change down through their operations. And then the third is that it's just, in the case of palm oil, difficult in the real world, actually difficult to drive change in a very complicated landscape of Indonesia. Complicated in terms of just agricultural production, but also governance and economy. And so, to oversimplify that, what you ran into in the case of palm oil was the risk that you'd be honoring a sustainability commitment at the expense of the interest of small producers, and that just wasn't a tenable position. So finding a solution to that became imperative, and some companies had more stamina in that effort than others, right? I mean, more willingness to sort of take it on. In the case of, but when it comes to the small producer side, well, sorry, let me just quickly on big companies. I think what Walmart's run into in sustainable seafood is a different kind of challenge, which is that the world is not serving up sustainable seafood in all the domains in which they need it, right? Because Walmart depended on there being adequate supply, meaning large supply of the way there. So 85% of its wild capture is certified, but a lot of it, but the remainder, they haven't been able to find supplies to meet that commitment. On the small producer side, yeah, this is absolutely the ballgame more broadly, not just in certification, but generally how do we actually build a future in which small producers thrive, selling into global markets? And there is a power imbalance there. I think I think the kind of pressure we've seen around environmental sustainability can also be brought on social sustainability, and that can be a vehicle for some accountability for big companies to treat small producers fairly. But I think it's going to be a central challenge in figuring out how we build these efforts over time. And it's a reason why doing this with markets in tandem with government is particularly important, because in the end, government has an indispensable role in making sure that these things roll out in a way that benefit its people. So those things have to come together that way.
I have another question if nobody else has one. So in both of the topics that you mentioned, certifications were very important. And at least the way that I imagine, there's probably some tension that you want to allow these big players to buy in quickly. So you want to be able to provide a lot of supply very quickly, which maybe means that you want to have your standards not too high, but at the same time, you might want over time to increase these standards. And maybe there's a danger there that once you put the label sustainable on something, it will be very difficult to in the future say, hey, on second thought, maybe we want to require more. Is that something that these certification agencies have faced and that they maybe have strategies for?
Yes and yes. I mean, you put your finger on a fundamental challenge in this approach. I would say a couple things about that. One is that, you know, certification's only valuable. Well, okay. I think a core part of the value proposition of certification is the prospect of market significance, right? I mean, that some significant share of the market could rise to that bar. And therefore it could be a vehicle for significant change in the market. So it's a very, it cannot be, the standard cannot be set at perfection, right? I mean, at the expense of having any market participation. But how to set that bar is therefore, of course, a hard fought decision and very just intrinsically difficult. The way MSC sets that bar, for example, is to focus on best practice and you know, quite extensive scientific process around defining what best practice is. But inevitably, the setting of the bar causes a lot of heartburn, both in the environmental community, who are concerned about things that aren't addressed, and in the industry, which is concerned about, you know, that it's higher than they would like it to be. So that's the first thing. It's just intrinsically challenging. Number two, yes, it is a bar that I think needs to be rising over time. But in particular, because our understanding of sustainability evolves, we begin to learn more about what matters and things that need to be addressed that we weren't aware of before. But also because, you know, one would like to see, if you have to compromise in the initial setting of the bar, you'd like to see continuous improvement. And that's, yes, also just intrinsically difficult. So the MSC bar has risen, has been revised upwards 2 or 3 times over the last decade. They're in a process now of looking at how it should be further revised, but that's a core challenge at the center of this approach for sure. Oh, sorry, let me say one other thing, which is that you also get to, I think, as these efforts start, you also see that this challenge leads to a kind of chicken and egg problem, right? I mean, that is, how do you establish a system that on the one hand has enough demand that producers are interested in, has on the other hand has enough production that buyers have something to buy, right? And so there is the challenge of where you set the bar, and also the sort of companion challenge of how do you get this going in a way that actually can scale, because each is waiting on the other, right? Producers waiting to see that someone is ready to buy their fish, buyers sort of unwilling to commit when there's nothing that they could buy. And that's a persistent challenge through the system.
Thank you.
Yep.
I wanted to ask about some ideas that this raises for me as to research questions that could be addressed by this community. So I'm just going to outline a few of them and get your feedback maybe on other research questions that you think are important, and any potential solutions or methods you've seen tried for these questions I'm about to list out. So I thought it was interesting that you mentioned ways to incentivize smallholders to participate. One particular mechanism, which I found really interesting, was the certification of large cooperatives. So the idea that it may be more difficult for small companies to meet the demands for certification, but that they could form these coalitions that together can pool resources and accomplish this. And so I was wondering, for that question, are there questions like, how well is it understood how to identify these cooperatives? How are the incentives different for a cooperative versus just one company? Yeah, so that's one research question I think could be interesting. Another one you mentioned was, I think of in the context of data markets. And so you'd mentioned in the context of small scale shrimp farmers, I forget which company it was, maybe it was Thai Union, that was looking for ways to compensate the farmers for providing data to the company. And so in that context, how does it determine the value of the information that's being given? Does that affect at all how it pays the farmers? And yeah, also issues of data ownership. I think that's very interesting to many people in this group. Another comment on this certification and moving the bar that you just mentioned, I was wondering how much of that question is the level at which we should set the bar, and how much of the challenges there are political, sort of getting people to buy in to be happy with the current bar and not upset if it starts moving upwards. Because I know there is economic literature on incentives with increasing bars. And so if the question is more how to set the bar rather than backlash to the fact that there's a rising bar, then maybe there are some things that can be done there. Yeah, so that was just 3 research questions that your talk made me think about.
Okay, let me, I have the most to say about the first one, so I'm going to go in reverse order. So I think it would be really interesting to talk about dig a little further into sort of what might be done to illuminate the debates about where to set the bar. I think you have several things going on. I mean, one is, so what should be the basis for defining quote unquote sustainability, and to what extent is that a scientific question, and to what extent is it a social value question, a question of values and political determination, if you will, small p. And that's a very hard question in the context of a system like MSC, because there's a lot of strength in positioning yourself as science-based, right? And positioning the standard as derived from science, as opposed to derived from some assessment of judgment. So it'd be interesting to dig into that further. I mean, at a basic level, it's also just it's a natural tension between 2 competing interest groups. But I think interesting to think about whether there's a way we could illuminate that might be helpful. In terms of how they set the price for data, I don't know, but we're very close to Thai Union, and so it'd be easy to ask and to explore that, and to Fishcoin, the company that's doing that experiment. So it'd be interesting but it would be easy to talk to them and explore whether there are questions there that one might illuminate. The question of cooperation, I think, is profoundly important, and for me, there are 2. Let's just take 2 models as examples of how that plays out that might provide sort of concrete context for thinking about what the research questions are. So one is fishing cooperatives, which are, let's just say, groups of fishers who are all on the same resource, right? They're catching blue crab in Indonesia, they're catching lobster in Baja, whatever. And there it's a matter of, that's a cooperative in a classic and sort of understood sense. And I think there are the questions. I mean, I assume there are some questions about how does a cooperative like that come together, and how does one manage those dynamics over time? And there has been deep experience in some of those cases, in Baja in particular, but in other small scale fishing cooperatives. There is, for me, an equally important model, which is jurisdictional. right? What you see with there is greatest interest at the moment in the case of palm oil, but I think it's also interesting in the case of fisheries as well as in other commodities, and looking at these challenges through a jurisdictional lens. So could you try to drive sustainability and offer certification at the level of a county or a province, for example, as opposed to one producer at a time? And so therefore define define the certification process according to those political boundaries, right? And create an incentive at that and reward at that level. And the advantage of a jurisdictional approach is, number one, it gets you to scale, right? Some large number of producers, depending on how you draw what jurisdiction you choose, but also allows you to mesh the sort of market incentive with government capability, because governments operate, of course, in terms of jurisdictions. So can you create a system in which, for example, the state of Sabah in Malaysia can get certified because of its overall production in palm oil, even though that's thousands of producers, but you're looking at that jurisdictional level to decide whether they've met the bar and to provide that incentive and reward. And making that work seems to me super important. And it would be great if there are interesting research questions embedded in it.
Maybe something related to the third idea that Irene brought up. So right now, we're thinking about these certifications as a binary bar. Either you're sustainable or you're not. You could imagine exposing more information to the consumer. Maybe there are different tiers. For example, I'm from Germany originally, so there, for example, eggs come in different tiers of how well they're produced in terms of welfare. There are NGOs, for example, that try to produce point rankings for animal welfare. And maybe it would be interesting to see, because, for example, from the supermarket on the supermarket side, it's really nice to say, okay, we want you to commit to at least this much sustainability for everything. So for that, maybe this binary threshold is a very good thing. But maybe at the same time, having something more continuous would, for example, allow the companies to compete for more sustainability even after the first threshold. So I think it's very non-obvious to me what the effects would be of different systems. Maybe you have thoughts on that.
Well, I would love to look at whether there's a way to get at that question. It's been very hotly debated. Do you diminish the value of MSC certification if there's a gold, silver, bronze kind of tiering, right? And I mean, so I think it's super interesting. And what I like about it is the possibility that you could reward sort of better than good performance, right? I mean, that is, fisheries that step beyond the bar to a sort of even higher level of performance could have some incentive and reward for doing that. But you could also find a way to incentivize those who aren't yet up to the bar, right? And I think it's super interesting. There's very active debate and very different instincts about which approach is more promising. It would be super to dig into that in a systematic way and just begin to see if you could analyze how each would play out in terms of the incentives it creates.
That sounds fascinating. Where do these debates take place?
In the Marine Stewardship Council community. I realize it probably isn't in the shortened bio that I provided or that we used for this, but I'm on the board of MSC. Should have mentioned that at the beginning. So in the board, but also in the stakeholder council, in the sort of, among the environmental and industry groups who are all part of the stakeholder community for MSC. There's been a long running conversation about, how does one begin to create a structure that incentivizes both better than good performance, but also provides a pathway, as it were, for fisheries that are not yet up to the standard.
Thanks, sorry.
Thanks so much for these questions. I think we're close to wrapping up. Are there any other questions?
I would suggest we're over time, so maybe we can wrap up now, but I see that there's one last question on the live stream, and so I'm just going to ask it here. And If anyone needs to leave, feel free to leave. Sorry for going a bit over time. We had a lot of questions for Jim. So the question on the live stream is, can you comment on how all of these challenges and problems that you're raising interact with population growth and growing demand for natural resources? How can we account for that as we're essentially trying to curb the amount of natural resources that we're currently using?
Yeah, I think, I mean, so the challenge of sustainability is a challenge that reflects not only will there be more of us, but that we will, each of us, we are also making more and more demands on the Earth systems, and so it's both a challenge of population growth and growing prosperity and consumption, and that makes these things fundamentally important, right? And it means that it is far more important than ever that we find a way to actually manage these resources, that we find a way to to produce the vegetable oil that we need without destroying more forest, that we find a way to manage fisheries within the limits of the ecosystems that support them, and in a time when those ecosystems are under other stresses. So finding ways that markets actually support sustainability, support better management of the resources on which we all depend, is more acutely important than it has ever been. And you know, it's not to say that these solutions by themselves are going to meet the challenge that you identify. We also, of course, at the same time, have to help people shift to diets that are lighter on the planet. So diets that are more plant-based, diets that that eat lower on the food chain to the extent they eat animal protein, et cetera, right? I mean, there are many strands to what it takes to get to sustainability. These are two important pieces. They need to be complemented by action on many other fronts.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for participating, and thank you so much, Jim, for the wonderful talk. For any lingering questions, feel free to email us, and we hope to see you at the next Colloquium too.
Right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.